Hi everybody, my name is Mujtaba Rahman, or Mij Rahman as I'm known here at Eurasia Group. We're here from London. I run our European analysis, and what I want to do over the next 10 or so minutes is talk about some of the risks we're concerned about in Europe over the course of 2017. And what I want to do is touch upon all of the elections we're going to see in France, in Germany, potentially in Italy, and of course in Greece as well, and how they're affecting some of the challenges EU leaders are going to face over the course of this year. Please feel free to post questions. I'll take a look at those at the end of my short remarks, and we'll certainly try and address those in the Q&A. So do post questions, and let's try and make this as interactive as possible. So 2017, look, I mean, the thing that's really interesting about 2017 is there's been a whole host of challenges the European Union has been trying to resolve since 2008. Part of it is about economics and trying to make the single currency, the euro, perform more effectively. And of course, there was a big crisis in Greece several years ago. There's a risk that you get that type of crisis again this year. Maybe it will come from France, maybe it'll come from Italy, it may again come from Greece, but the point is those problems haven't been fully resolved, right? The euro remains a really very, very fragile enterprise, and I think it's worth thinking through some of those challenges. Alongside that, you again have a potential problem, if I can put it like that, with refugees. Of course, in 2015, Europe saw a huge intake in refugee numbers that was driven by a large amount of instability in the Middle East and North Africa. Some of those challenges in the Middle East and North Africa, of course, remain real. The reason we're not seeing refugee flows into Europe right now is because of a deal the Europeans have done with Turkey that keeps refugees in Turkey. The point is that deal is very vulnerable, especially in light of some of the challenges we're seeing in Turkey today as the president of that country tries to reform his constitution, to control his country, to centralize powers. And that introduces a number of risks, not only for Turkey, but for the rest of Europe as well. There's, of course, a problem of political populism. That's inherent in a large number of political systems in Europe today, and in a context where you have the two most important countries in the European Union, France and, of course, Germany, going through their elections in a context where these populist forces exist. That, of course, presents challenges to incumbents and presents challenges to the policy environment as well. On top of that, you have Russia and Russia's, let's say, role in challenging the EU project and challenging the integrity of the European integration process. And as I say, what's interesting about this year is all of those challenges come together. They all exist. They're all on the agenda, and they're going to interact with this election cycle that I'm talking about. So you have a set of big picture challenges that haven't been resolved since 2008, alongside a set of elections that I think both interact and create the conditions for a very volatile and indeed risky year. Maybe I'll start with France, because kind of that's where I think a lot of our clients, our audience, which is investors, that's where they're focused. Really the big concern in France is Marine Le Pen, and whether Marine Le Pen can win the presidential elections that are slated to take place in May. Now, we at Eurasia Group, we don't think that's likely, but at the same time, we don't think it's completely impossible. We have assigned a probability to this outcome, and that probability is 30%. Now, 30% is a big number. If Marine Le Pen were to win the presidency in France, I really do think you're looking, frankly speaking, at a very different Eurozone and potentially a very, very different European Union as well. Most likely, Le Pen's going to be facing François Fillon, who is the candidate for the centre-right, in the second round. The big concern, I think, is Fillon is a centre-right candidate. He's running on a very robust economic reform platform. He's socially conservative. That appeals to a certain demographic in France, but it also alienates another demographic, and the demographic I'm talking about is, of course, centre-left voters. If centre-left voters decide they can't vote for Fillon, they don't want to turn out and vote, they're going to spoil their ballots, that reduces the threshold necessary for Marine Le Pen to achieve a majority. And if indeed that were to happen, as I say, it will really question, I think, the underpinnings of the European Union as we know it since the creation of the EU in the aftermath of the Second World War and the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions. Switching from Marine Le Pen is the Brexit challenge, right? On the 23rd of June last year, British voters decided to, in a referendum, decided to opt to leave the European Union. That process hasn't really started. The government's still trying to determine what its negotiating objectives are, but I do think from March this year, the government will begin the formal process to pull the UK out of the EU. That also comes with lots and lots of risks, again, not simply for the UK, but also for the rest of the EU as well. The first question is, what kind of relationship will the UK seek with the European Union? And, you know, broadly speaking, there are a number of different models that one can take off the shelf. Norway is a very good example of one of those models, where we would essentially maintain all of the obligations of membership as well as access to the single market, which is, you know, the reason to remain an EU member. It has large economic benefits because you can trade with all of these other countries that share the common market. I think the UK is unlikely to seek membership of the single market. The reason is Theresa May, UK Prime Minister, wants to control immigration from the rest of Europe. And David Davis, who is working in her cabinet and indeed her Brexit secretary, so who's been tasked with implementing Brexit, he wants to gain control rather of sovereignty over UK laws and UK trade policy. And if you do those three things, if you control immigration, if you have more say over UK trade policy and more say over UK laws, then you can't have access and membership to this large common market that I'm talking about. So that's what people in the media are calling a quote-unquote hard Brexit. It means we move from membership to an arrangement with the Europeans that's essentially a bilateral trade agreement. And that will take, you know, it could take up to 10 years to negotiate, maybe even longer. When we leave the European Union in 2019, there's a risk that we fall to what is known as the default WTO trade arrangement that would introduce lots of transaction costs, lots of tariffs on our interaction with other European markets. That's going to be bad for the economy here in the UK. It's also going to be bad for the economy in the rest of Europe. And for those reasons, people are very, very concerned. But as I say, Theresa May, that, you know, she's still not spoken explicitly about the government's objectives, but everything she and her ministers have said regarding immigration, regarding sovereignty over trade policy and our laws, suggests we're not looking to maintain the kind of relationship we've had with Europe over the last 40 odd years. So Brexit's something I think that investors are also very, very concerned about. Then there's the bigger, I think, macro question in Europe about populism and populist forces. And of course, Trump's success in the US does create another further boost for populist forces here on the continent. I think in every large country there are large populist forces that are challenging governments and preventing them being able to move forward with decisive action that addresses citizens' concerns, whether it's reducing unemployment, whether it's addressing the terrorist threat, whether it's introducing policies to improve growth. Leaders simply can't implement those measures because they're unpopular, and in a context where they're fighting against populist insurgencies, it of course all becomes very difficult. Marine Le Pen, I think, is the foremost rather populist figure on the European continent we're most concerned about. But in Italy, you have the Five-Star Movement. I think that's something that's a concern. Of course, you have UKIP in this country. You have Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. There are elections there in a couple of months. All of these factors, I think, have been aggravated by Trump's election victory. And that, again, I think creates big concerns and big risks for those of us watching the landscape here in Europe. I think they're really the three major issues that I wanted to talk about in this short presentation today. I think what we'll do is we'll end this presentation today. Again, my name is Rahman. I'm the managing director here for Europe at the Eurasia Group, where we're interacting with you live now from London. And over time, as we do more of these, it would be excellent to get some questions from the audience and to interact on that basis. I think actually there may be one question coming through now. Thanks, Colleen. So the question is from Matt. Thanks very much for the question. if Le Pen wins in France, would that mean that Merkel is doomed? Yeah, actually, Matt, I don't think that's the case. I think the contexts are very different. So Angela Merkel, German Chancellor, she's facing re-election in Germany in September, and people are very concerned about a political party in Germany known as the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. They are a populist party. They were started several years ago, running on an explicitly anti-Euro platform, and over time they've added elements to the platform. They're now anti-immigration, they're anti-EU, and they're likely to command something like 15 to 20% in the parliamentary elections in September. So if Le Pen wins in France, that doesn't mean Merkel won't win re-election in Germany. I think she will, but the AfD in Germany is a force to be reckoned with, and that will mean that Merkel is weaker once she wins re-election in September. So I don't necessarily think there's a direct relationship between the two elections, but I do think Merkel has to be mindful of the AfD, and that's going to affect Merkel's ability and Germany's ability to help resolve all of these challenges EU leaders are facing in 2017. We also have a question from Charles. Thanks, Charles, for flagging your question. Will there be an early election in the UK this year? I don't think so. I think Theresa May is of the mindset to wait to implement Brexit and then go back to her electorate, to the country in 2020 once Brexit has been implemented, and try and win re-election on that platform. Very, very difficult for a Tory Prime Minister to call a general election before having implemented Brexit. Voters have spoken in 2016. They want to leave the European Union. Very hard for Theresa May to go back to the country and now ask for a mandate from people before she's actually implemented the referendum result that people are expecting. That's why I think the government will trigger the so-called Article 50 in the first quarter of this month, most likely March. You then have a 2-year negotiation with the rest of the Europeans. At the end of that process, the UK will leave the EU, and then I think 2020, which is when the next general election is slated, Theresa May will hold an election, and I think she will win. The opposition in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, they're not particularly effective. I don't think Jeremy Corbyn is going anywhere. Nobody wants to challenge his leadership. People in the party have tried, they failed. I think they've now settled and have accepted the idea that Corbyn will run the party into the next election. They will lose that election, and then there will be a leadership challenge after the election that allows Labour to regenerate and indeed become a more effective opposition. So, Charles, to your question, no general election risk, I think, this year, more likely in 2020. Dan Jensen's asked a very interesting question. How has the migrant crisis shaped populism in Europe? Well, I think in a number of ways, Dan. In the first instance, it's bolstered populism, and it's done that in a set of countries where populism wasn't really an issue. I think from 2008 to 2012-13, the biggest issues in populism was driven by economics, and that was in Southern Europe. You had countries like Portugal, Spain, Greece, being forced to implement reforms and a huge amount of fiscal tightening, austerity, that absolutely decimated leaders' popularity, increased unemployment, put lots of people out of work because economic reform always works with a time lag, and that bolstered populist forces in Southern Europe, but that was driven by economics. What's happened since 2012 is Northern Europe, through the migrant crisis, has also developed large and potent populist forces, and that's been driven, as you correctly say, by the refugee crisis. I think that's absolutely the case in the Netherlands, it's the case in France, it's the case in Germany, it's the case in Austria, all of these countries along the Balkan route, and indeed in Central and Eastern Europe as well. So it's created a type of populism that didn't exist before. That populism is motivated by anti-immigration, and that, I think, has really paralyzed decision-making at the European level. When Angela Merkel says we need collectively to agree a response to deal with the refugee crisis, it's very hard for her to build consensus on that with the rest of Europe, given some of these populist forces in Northern Europe that are being driven by immigration. We have a great question from Salomon. What will Brexit look like in December 2017? It's going to look noisy. I think that's really the best way to answer that question. You know, Brexit won't actually be implemented until 2019. And I think your question implies that you absolutely understand that. We begin the negotiation this year. That takes 2 years, but there will be lots of different flashpoints. The first flashpoint will be the Supreme Court. It's due to rule in around a couple of weeks over whether Parliament should have a say in the triggering of Article 50 and should be able to influence the government's decision-making around what it's looking to do with the rest of Europe. That will be very noisy. I think the Supreme Court will give Parliament a role. That will slow down the Brexit process a little bit, but not too much. After that, in May, when the UK government gives its Queen's speech, there will be the Great Repeal Bill. That's when the UK government will bring all of the body of European law onto the UK statute book. So at that point, it can decide which bits of this legislation from Europe we want to keep, what we want to amend, what we want to edit. That process will also take time and indeed will be noisy. So there's no real firm conclusions on Brexit over the course of this year, but I do think the process will be extremely noisy given some of these events that are indeed on the calendar. I'm going to take one final question and then we're going to have to wrap the session. Will terrorism play a role in European elections this year? And that's the question by Jeff Willis. I think yes, that's a simple answer to the question. And the country we're most concerned about is Germany and Angela Merkel. I mean, Angela Merkel took a very long time to announce that she was going to run for a 4th term. And part of the reason she took such a long time was because once she announces her candidacy for the chancellorship, she is the candidate. And from that point forward, extremely vulnerable to any outside event that may affect her popularity. And in the context of Germany, that of course relates to terrorism. We've seen a number of attacks on the back of the refugee crisis committed by refugees in Germany that were led in the wave in 2015 that have kind of converged on the attacks we've seen on France, but they've not really impacted Merkel's popularity to the same extent they've hurt leaders in other countries. And here I'm thinking about François Hollande. If you were to see consistent terrorist attacks over the course of this year, that of course affects the question as to whether or not Merkel can win. But assuming she does win, and I think she will, it certainly will impact the strength of her majority on the other side. So this is all bad for Merkel. There's really only downside risk, if I can put it like that, for her over the course of this year. And the largest single threat to her majority and, let's say, strength once the elections are over is the terrorist threat. And I think that's very particular in Germany. We've reached the kind of the end of this session. I want to thank you all for joining. Thank you for your great questions. My name is Rahman. I run the Europe team here at Eurasia Group. We're coming to you live on Facebook from London, and I do hope we'll have the opportunity to do this many times in the future going forward. So thank you, everybody.